Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most complex, fascinating, and honestly misunderstood conditions the human mind has ever encountered. We're going to strip away all that noise, rely strictly on the medical facts, and use some engaging visual storytelling to map out exactly what's going on in the brain. It's going to completely reshape how you view this diagnosis.
Seriously, I want you to just pause for a second. Think about your own gut reaction. When you hear the word schizophrenia, what's the very first image that pops into your head? What's the first word? Look, for most of us, those immediate reactions, they're not based on medical science at all. They're built on decades of movies, TV shows, and some pretty deeply ingrained cultural biases. We carry these preconceived notions around without even realizing it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because, society is incredibly quick to label things it doesn't quite understand. These heavy, stigmatizing labels get thrown around so casually, right? Words like crazy, dangerous, split personality. Or that super dismissive one, oh, they were always weird anyway. But here's the reality. Just because we don't understand a behavior doesn't mean it's madness. These labels aren't just fundamentally flawed, they're actively harmful. They're used for humiliation and fear, not understanding. So it is definitely time we swap out those labels for actual science.
To really grasp the medical reality here, we've got to start with the word itself. Schizophrenia actually comes from two Greek roots, schizo, which means split, and phren, meaning mind. Now you can probably see how a literal translation of that has caused like a century of public confusion. People hear split and mind, and they immediately jump to a very specific and entirely wrong conclusion.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly where that confusion lies. In the medical world, a split mind refers to a disruption, a fragmentation in how a person's thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are integrated. It does absolutely not mean a split personality. I want to be as clear as possible here. Schizophrenia does not mean someone has two or more separate identities living inside them. That is a complete myth. The core issue is a disturbance in reality testing, not multiple people occupying a single body.
To ground ourselves in clinical reality, let's look at the DSM-5. The diagnostic standards here are incredibly rigorous. Diagnosing schizophrenia isn't just about someone acting a little strange on a Tuesday afternoon. It requires continuous signs of a disturbance for at least 6 full months. And within that window, there has to be at least 1 month of what's called active phase symptoms. Plus, it requires a significant drop in how the patient functions socially or at work. It's a highly specific chronic medical condition.
So the crucial point is understanding how these symptoms actually show up. Psychiatrists divide them into two main buckets. First, positive symptoms. Now that doesn't mean good, it means something is actively added to the person's reality. Think hallucinations, like hearing voices that others don't, or delusions, which are intensely fixed false beliefs. But then we have the negative symptoms. This means something is subtracted from their normal functioning. We're talking about a massive drop in motivation, a flattening of emotional expression, and a severe withdrawal from social life.
You know, these negative symptoms are often the most profoundly misunderstood part of the whole disorder. In daily life, this looks like a slow, quiet withdrawal. A person might speak significantly less, which is a condition called alogia. Their face might show almost no outward emotion. They might start neglecting personal care, or you might see a sharp decline in how they're doing at school or work. And we really need to emphasize this. It is not a choice. It's an invisible, incredibly heavy burden that just drains a person's energy and their basic ability to function.
And this isn't just some localized regional view either. The ICD-10 criteria, which is the international standard recognized by the World Health Organization, maps out the exact same complex patterns globally. It details things like the echo of thoughts, delusions of control, and those persistent negative symptoms we just talked about. It really reinforces that whether you're in a clinic in New York, London, or Istanbul, these specific symptoms are part of a chronic, universally recognized medical framework. Because these symptoms are just so incredibly complex, we need to do some rapid-fire myth-busting. First up, it is absolutely not laziness. When someone with schizophrenia seems unmotivated, or stays in bed, or barely speaks, society is so quick to just call them lazy. But as we just saw with those negative symptoms, this is literally the illness at work. It's an inability to initiate and sustain goal-directed activities. They are struggling with a severe medical deficit. They aren't just choosing to slack off. Second myth, it is not a weakness of character. Schizophrenia isn't about a lack of willpower. It's not some sort of moral failing. You can't just tell someone in the middle of a psychotic episode to pull themselves together or stop exaggerating. Saying that honestly only makes them feel more isolated. I mean, you wouldn't tell someone with a broken leg to just walk it off, right? Well, we absolutely shouldn't do that with a neurodevelopmental brain disorder either.
Third, and this really dismantles one of the most toxic stigmas out there, it is not inherently dangerous. The vast majority of people diagnosed with schizophrenia are not violent, period. The data clearly shows that the risk of dangerous behavior basically only goes up when there's an untreated severe psychotic relapse or if there's concurrent substance abuse going on. The idea that having this diagnosis automatically makes someone a physical threat to society, that's purely a Hollywood fabrication.
And finally, wrapping up our myth-busting, it is not hopeless. Look, yes, schizophrenia is a profoundly serious illness, but serious does not mean a life sentence of misery. With the right interventions, so many people with this diagnosis achieve real stability. They hold down jobs, they maintain loving relationships, and they live deeply meaningful lives. This whole narrative of inevitable tragedy, that's something we have to actively rewrite.
But rewriting that narrative is incredibly tough because of the dual tragedy of stigma. Researchers Corrigan and Watson put it perfectly. There's public stigma, which is the outward prejudice and discrimination a patient faces every day. But then there's the self-stigma, and this is heartbreaking. It's when the person internalizes all that public hate and fear and actually begins to believe they're worthless or dangerous or just permanently broken. That internalization is a massive, devastating barrier to recovery.
And the real-world impact of all this stigma, it's highly measurable and utterly tragic. It leads to severe social exclusion, shutting people out from basic health care, education, and safe housing. We see human rights violations happening in institutions and right in our own communities. But the absolute most shocking data point is that last one. People with schizophrenia die, on average, 9 years earlier than the general population. And that's not just from the disorder itself. It's heavily driven by neglected physical illnesses, cardiovascular issues, and a total systemic failure to provide equitable health care. Think about that. Stigma is literally shortening lives.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what happens when you compare public attitudes across different diagnoses. Based on some huge data from a Science Direct study, a glaring bias emerges. Compared to things like depression and anxiety, schizophrenia carries the absolute highest amount of negative stereotypes. And get this, even though the public actually blames the patient less for schizophrenia than they do for anxiety or depression, they have the lowest belief that a schizophrenia patient can ever recover. Society essentially views it as this permanent, terrifying state.
So how on earth did we get to this level of stigma? Well, a quick glance at history explains a lot. Back in antiquity, the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia were just chalked up to supernatural forces. Then, during the Middle Ages, that morphed into these terrifying beliefs about demonic possession, which led to literal exorcisms and witchcraft accusations. It wasn't until the modern era that we finally developed a medical and scientific framework to treat this as what it is, a psychiatric disorder. We are literally fighting centuries of dark, fear-based mythology. Let's move to and see how this builds a framework for actual hope and a really clear path to stability. It all starts with a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, just to make sure no other medical conditions are causing these symptoms. Then comes proper medical treatment, which often involves antipsychotic medications. But here's the thing, medicine alone isn't enough. Step 3, having strong family and social support is absolutely critical. And finally, Step 4, psychoeducation and rehabilitation. This is all about teaching the patient and their community how to manage the illness, spot the triggers, and maintain everyday functioning. It's a multifaceted, highly effective approach.
Which brings us to our final thought. Schizophrenia is an illness that, by its very nature, disrupts a person's reality. It makes it incredibly hard for them to tell what's real and what isn't. But as we've seen throughout this explainer, the myths, the fears, the societal labels, they aren't real either. They are just stigma. So, the question I'm leaving you with today is this. Schizophrenia disrupts a person's reality. Will you let stigma disrupt yours? Thank you so much for joining me, for focusing on the facts, and for keeping an open mind.